belong here. People like you don't fly first class. I'll allow you to be a disruption to people that matters. Get out of here! Ow!
Gate agent breaks black girl's arm. Moments later, she's fired on the spot. And what happened in those agonizing minutes before help arrived will make you question everything you thought you knew about who protects children when authority figures decide that skin color justifies violence. You people always have a sob story, always begging, always taking what isn't yours. Gate agent Rhonda Marsh had spat at 13-year-old Gabrielle, who stood at gate 17 clutching boarding documents and a small gift bag containing a handmade bracelet for her dying aunt. Her voice dripping with the kind of contempt that came from 49 years of believing some children deserved compassion while others deserved cruelty based solely on the color of their skin. The accusation hit Gabrielle like a physical blow, confusion and shame flooding her young face because she wasn't begging or taking. She was just trying to board a flight her church had helped pay for so she could see Aunt Monica one last time before cancer took her, so she could deliver a bracelet she'd made bead by bead while praying for healing that might not come. The words you people had carried centuries of hatred compressed into 2 syllables, had communicated that this gate agent saw a 13-year-old black girl in simple clothes with natural hair and decided she was a problem to be managed rather than a child to be protected. Now before you tell yourself this kind of vicious racial profiling doesn't happen anymore at major airports in 2024, before you convince yourself that gate agents wouldn't assault a child for trying to see her dying aunt, let me destroy that comfortable illusion right now. This happened 9 months ago at a busy terminal, witnessed by dozens of passengers who recorded on their phones but not one intervened until a child's bone was breaking. The racism didn't end with the civil rights movement. It just learned to wear employee badges and hide behind claims of difficult passengers and behavioral concerns. It evolved to justify violence against black children while bystanders watched and did nothing. Gabrielle had looked at Rhonda Marsh with eyes that recognized this hatred even though she'd never experienced it quite this brutally, had felt her 13-year-old heart breaking because she'd been so careful with her documentation, so polite in her requests, so desperate to get to Houston before it was too late, and still this woman had made her wait 30 minutes, had scattered her papers on the floor, had called her a charity case loud enough for strangers to hear. She wasn't surprised that a white authority figure was treating her with contempt, wasn't shocked that following every rule and showing every document hadn't protected her from racism, because her mother had warned her that sometimes being perfect still wouldn't be enough when people had already decided you were less than. "Please ma'am, my aunt is dying," Gabrielle had whispered through tears, clutching the gift bag tighter. "This might be my last chance to see her. I made her a bracelet and I need to give it to her before," but her voice had broken on the word before because saying it out loud made it too real, made the possibility of Aunt Monica dying without seeing her niece one last time feel inevitable rather than preventable. Rhonda had grabbed Gabrielle's arm then with violence that seemed designed to punish rather than redirect, had yanked with enough force to twist a 13-year-old body unnaturally, and the sickening crack that had followed would echo through the terminal and through Gabrielle's nightmares and through every witness's conscience for months to come. The sound of a child's bone breaking had been unmistakable, had been followed immediately by Gabrielle's scream of pure agony as she'd collapsed to the cold floor cradling an arm that bent at angles arms should never bend. "My arm," Gabrielle had sobbed, looking at the visible displacement of bone beneath her skin, looking at the scattered beads from her aunt's bracelet rolling across the terminal floor. "Please help me, please somebody help me, I just wanted to see my auntie." Passengers had gasped and recorded and some had finally started shouting for help, but for 30 critical minutes before the assault they'd watched a gate agent humiliate a child and they'd said nothing. They'd stepped around scattered papers and averted their eyes and prioritized their own comfort over defending a 13-year-old being racially profiled and degraded. If you believe children should never have their arms broken by gate agents for trying to see dying relatives, keep watching because what happens when the airport director sees the footage will restore your faith that sometimes justice is immediate. If you think airport violence against black children is rare, you need to see the 30 minutes of humiliation that led to this assault. And if you've ever been treated like you don't belong somewhere because of how you look, drop a comment below. Tell us your story, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. We're reading every single one. This story doesn't end the way you think. Hit that like button if you stand against racism. Subscribe to this channel because we're exposing incidents that airlines pray you'll never see. And trust me, what one airport director does when she watches a gate agent break a child's arm will prove that sometimes firing on the spot is exactly the justice cruelty deserves. But to understand how 13-year-old Gabrielle ended up on a terminal floor with a broken arm and scattered bracelet beads rolling away from her reaching fingers, how a simple trip to see her dying aunt became a nightmare of racial violence and physical assault, we need to go back 24 hours to when this journey was supposed to be nothing but love crossing distance. Back to when Gabrielle's biggest worry was whether she'd finish the bracelet in time and not whether she'd survive. Checking in at the gate. Gabrielle Thompson was a quiet girl, 13 years old and small for her age, the kind of child who said please and thank you without being reminded, who helped her mother with groceries without being asked, who spent her allowance on craft supplies to make gifts for people she loved rather than buying things for herself. She lived with her mother Denise in a small apartment on the south side, her father having passed away from a heart attack when she was 9, leaving just the two of them to navigate life together with tight budgets and tighter embraces. Her Aunt Monica was her mother's younger sister, 38 years old and fighting stage 4 breast cancer that had metastasized to her bones and liver, fighting with chemotherapy that made her sick and radiation that burned her skin and hope that was fading with each doctor's appointment that brought worse news than the last. Monica lived in Houston where she'd moved for work 5 years earlier, lived alone now because the cancer had cost her the fiancé who'd promised forever but hadn't meant it when forever included sickness. The church Gabrielle and her mother attended had heard about Monica's declining health, had heard that Denise couldn't afford both the time off work and a plane ticket to send Gabrielle to Houston, had taken up a collection during Sunday service that raised enough for a ticket plus a little extra. Pastor Williams had presented the money to Denise with tears in his eyes, had said sometimes God's hands look like church family, had told Gabrielle she was carrying their prayers along with that ticket. Gabrielle had spent 2 weeks making the bracelet, sitting at their kitchen table every evening after homework stringing beads and patterns that spelled out hope and love and faith, choosing colors that reminded her of her aunt's favorite things, purple for the flowers Monica grew before she got too sick to garden, silver for the laugh she had that sounded like bells, gold for the way she made everything feel special. With each bead Gabrielle had whispered a prayer, had asked God to heal her aunt or at least let her live long enough for one more visit, one more hug, one more I love you. The morning of the flight Denise had driven Gabrielle to the airport even though it meant being late for her shift at the nursing home, had wanted to walk her daughter all the way to security, had checked and rechecked the unaccompanied minor paperwork that she'd filled out with careful attention to every detail. Baby, you call me the second you land, Denise had said, holding Gabrielle's face in both hands, and you give Auntie Monica the biggest hug from me, you tell her we love her and we're praying for her and she's going to beat this. Gabrielle had nodded even though they both knew Monica probably wasn't going to beat it, had clutched the gift bag with the bracelet and promised to be careful and brave. Her mother had hugged her so tight it hurt, had whispered you're my whole world baby girl, had watched her go through security with tears streaming down her face because sending your 13-year-old daughter alone on a plane to say goodbye to a dying sister felt like too much weight for such small shoulders. Gabrielle had made it through security without problems, had found her gate with an hour to spare, had sat quietly reviewing her boarding pass and unaccompanied minor documentation the way her mother had showed her. She'd watched families board earlier flights, had seen businessmen typing on laptops and tourists excited about vacations, had felt grown up and nervous and determined to make this trip go smoothly so her mother wouldn't worry. When it came time to check in as an unaccompanied minor, she'd approached the gate counter with her folder of paperwork organized exactly as instructed, had waited politely for the gate agent to finish with another passenger before stepping forward. Excuse me, ma'am, Gabrielle had said in her quiet, respectful voice. I'm an unaccompanied minor and I was told to check in here before boarding. Rhonda Marsh had looked up from her computer and Gabrielle had seen her expression change immediately, had watched warmth turn to coldness, had seen the gate agent's eyes travel from her natural hair pulled back in a puff to her simple clothes from the discount store to the homemade gift bag, had felt herself being assessed and found wanting in the space of seconds. Unaccompanied minor, Rhonda had repeated, her tone already carrying judgment. Where's your documentation? Gabrielle had handed over the folder her mother had prepared, every form completed in Denise's careful handwriting, every signature in place, every emergency contact listed with phone numbers double-checked. Rhonda had flipped through the papers like they were suspect, had examined the boarding pass like it might be counterfeit, had looked at Gabrielle with suspicion that had no basis except the color of her skin and the assumption that black children with church-funded tickets must be trying to get away with something. "These don't look right," Rhonda had announced, tossing the folder back across the counter hard enough that papers had scattered. "Where'd you get this ticket? Who paid for it? This seems irregular." The accusation that her ticket was fraudulent had made Gabrielle's stomach drop because everything was legitimate, everything was in order, her mother had checked 3 times. "My church helped pay for it, ma'am," Gabrielle had explained, her voice getting smaller. "For me to see my aunt in Houston, she has cancer and she's really sick and this might be my last chance to see her." "Your church," Rhonda had repeated with a laugh that held no humor. "How convenient, a charity case," and she'd said the words charity case loud enough that nearby passengers had turned to look, had marked Gabrielle as someone who didn't belong, someone who was taking resources meant for others, someone whose presence needed explaining and justifying. "Pick those up," Rhonda had commanded, gesturing to the scattered papers on the floor, "and wait over there until I verify this isn't fraud. I need to check with my supervisor about whether we can even accept tickets purchased this way." Gabrielle had knelt on the terminal floor gathering her documents while passengers had walked past stepping around her like she was an obstacle, like a 13-year-old girl on her knees collecting papers was just part of the airport landscape. Her face had burned with shame, her eyes had filled with tears she tried to blink back, her hands had shaken as she'd carefully reorganized the folder her mother had prepared with such care. She'd retreated to a seat near the windows and waited like she'd been told, had watched the minutes tick by while Rhonda had seemed to forget about her completely, had sat there clutching her gift bag and praying that this was just a delay and not a sign that she wouldn't make it to Houston at all. 30 minutes had crawled by with agonizing slowness, each minute feeling like an hour to Gabrielle, who sat near the windows watching other passengers move freely through the gate area, watching families laugh and businessmen sip coffee and elderly couples hold hands, watching everyone except herself being treated like human beings worthy of basic dignity. She checked her phone obsessively, had calculated and recalculated whether she'd still make her flight if boarding started soon, had tried to stay calm even though panic was building in her chest like water behind a dam. Her boarding pass said the flight would begin boarding at 2:15, and the digital clock on the departure board showed 2:10, and Rhonda still hadn't called her back to the counter, still hadn't verified anything, still seemed to have completely forgotten about the 13-year-old girl she'd humiliated and dismissed. Gabrielle had watched Rhonda help other passengers during those 30 minutes, had seen her smile at a white family and efficiently process their upgrade request, had observed her patiently explain gate changes to an elderly white woman who asked the same question 3 times. But when Gabrielle had caught Rhonda's eye from across the gate area, when she tried to signal that she was still waiting, the gate agent had looked right through her like she didn't exist, like making a black child wait indefinitely was just part of the normal airport routine. The casual cruelty of being ignored had hurt almost as much as being called a charity case, had made Gabrielle feel invisible in a way that was somehow worse than being seen and hated. At 2:12 Gabrielle had gathered her courage and approached the counter again, had walked slowly with her folder clutched against her chest and her gift bag hanging from her wrist. "Ma'am," she'd said quietly, trying not to sound demanding or impatient even though both emotions were churning inside her, "has my ticket been verified? Boarding starts in a few minutes and I don't want to miss my flight." Rhonda hadn't even looked up from her computer screen, had kept typing like Gabrielle wasn't standing right in front of her. "I said wait," she'd replied, her voice flat and cold. "I'm still checking on it. Go sit down." The dismissal had made Gabrielle's eyes sting with frustrated tears because this woman had had 30 minutes to verify a ticket that was perfectly legitimate, had helped a dozen other passengers in that time, had apparently decided that making Gabrielle anxious and afraid was more important than doing her job. "But ma'am," Gabrielle had tried again, her voice getting smaller with each word, "I don't want to miss my flight. My aunt is really sick and I need to see her. This might be my last chance." That's when Rhonda had finally looked up, had fixed Gabrielle with eyes that held something uglier than simple annoyance, something that looked almost like pleasure at having power over someone powerless. "I don't care about your aunt," Rhonda had said, each word precise and cutting, designed to wound. "I said wait, or do you not understand English? Maybe that's the problem here, maybe you need simpler instructions." The implication that Gabrielle was stupid, that her repeated polite questions indicated some failure of comprehension rather than legitimate concern about missing her flight, had made the tears spill over finally. Gabrielle had retreated to her seat feeling shame burn through her body, feeling foolish for crying, feeling angry at herself for not being strong enough to hold it together. She'd clutched the gift bag tighter, had pressed her fingers against the beads inside feeling their shapes through the fabric, had reminded herself that this was about Aunt Monica, about delivering love across distance, about being brave enough to endure cruelty if it meant getting to Houston. At 2:15 boarding had been announced and Gabrielle had watched the first group of passengers line up, had seen them hand their boarding passes to a different gate agent who'd appeared to help with the boarding process, had felt her anxiety spike because Rhonda still hadn't cleared her and the plane was starting to fill up. She'd sat there fighting the urge to approach the counter again because Rhonda had made it clear that asking questions only made things worse, had told herself to wait just a little longer, had prayed that surely the gate agent wouldn't actually let her miss the flight. Groups 2 and 3 had boarded, business travelers and families with small children filing down the jetway while Gabrielle remained in her seat, her leg bouncing with nervous energy, her heart racing with fear that was shifting from anxiety about missing the flight to genuine terror that she wouldn't get to see her aunt at all. She'd watched the boarding area slowly empty, had counted the passengers remaining, had done the math on whether there'd even be seats left by the time Rhonda decided to let her board. When Group 4 had been called, when the gate agent had announced that this was Gabrielle's boarding group, she'd stood on shaking legs and approached the counter one more time. "Ma'am," she'd said, trying to keep her voice steady even though she was crying openly now, "they called my boarding group. Can I please board now? I've been waiting like you said." Rhonda had stood then, had moved to position herself directly in front of the jetway entrance, had physically blocked Gabrielle's path with her body in a way that made other passengers turn to watch. "I haven't cleared you yet," she'd announced loudly enough that everyone in the remaining boarding group could hear, "Step aside and let these other passengers through." "But everyone else is boarding," Gabrielle had protested, her voice breaking. "The plane is leaving in 20 minutes and you still haven't told me if I can go. Please, I just need to know if my ticket is okay." "I said step aside," Rhonda had repeated, her voice rising to a shout now, drawing even more attention, turning what should have been a simple boarding process into a spectacle with Gabrielle at the center being marked as difficult, as problematic, as someone whose presence required explanation and justification. The passengers in line had been watching now, some with phones out recording, some looking uncomfortable, one or two whispering to each other, but not one had spoken up to question why a gate agent was preventing a crying child from boarding, why this girl was being singled out, why basic human decency seemed to be optional when the person needing it was young and black and alone. They just shifted in line and waited for the disruption to resolve itself, had chosen the comfort of silence over the risk of involvement. Gabrielle's tears had been falling steadily now, her nose running, her breath coming in hitching gasps. "Please," she'd begged, abandoning pride for desperate honesty, "my aunt has cancer and she might die and this might be the last time I ever see her. I made her a bracelet and I need to give it to her. Please ma'am, I'm not trying to cause trouble, I just want to see my auntie before it's too late." Something in Gabrielle's raw, desperate plea, something in her tears and her trembling voice and her complete vulnerability, had triggered rage in Rhonda rather than compassion, had sparked fury where kindness should have lived, had ignited cruelty that seemed to feed on a child's suffering rather than recoil from it. The sight of this 13-year-old black girl crying and begging had apparently offended Rhonda on some fundamental level, had challenged whatever twisted worldview required that certain children stay in their place and accept mistreatment without complaint. "You people always have a sob story," Rhonda had hissed, her face contorting with contempt that no longer tried to hide behind professional authority, "always begging for special treatment, always expecting the world to stop because you've got problems. Well, I've got news for you, little girl. Everyone has problems and yours don't matter more than anyone else's." The phrase "you people" had silenced the gate area, had made several passengers gasp audibly, had crossed a line from poor customer service into overt racism that even the most conflict-averse bystanders recognized as wrong. But still nobody had intervened, still nobody had stepped forward to defend a child being verbally assaulted by an adult with power, still the phones had kept recording while voices had stayed silent. "Always taking what isn't yours," Rhonda had continued, her voice getting louder with each word, charity cases thinking you deserve first-class treatment, thinking the rules don't apply to you. Well, they do apply, and I'm the one who enforces them, and I say you're not cleared to board this flight. She'd grabbed Gabrielle's arm then, her fingers digging into the thin flesh above the elbow, her grip immediately too tight, immediately painful in a way that made Gabrielle cry out in surprise and fear. I said step aside. Rhonda had snarled, yanking Gabrielle backward away from the jetway entrance, and the force she'd used had been excessive, had been violent, had been the physical manifestation of rage that had been building for 30 minutes of watching a black child refuse to disappear. Gabrielle's small body had twisted as Rhonda pulled, her feet scrambling to keep up with the momentum, her gift bag swinging wildly, and then something had given way with a sound that would replay in nightmares for everyone who heard it. The crack had been sickeningly loud, bone breaking under pressure it was never designed to withstand, radius and ulna fracturing simultaneously as Gabrielle's arm had bent at an angle that defied anatomy. The scream that had torn from Gabrielle's throat had been primal, pain and shock and terror compressed into sound that echoed off the terminal ceiling and silenced every conversation within 100 feet. She'd crumpled to the floor still screaming, her left arm cradled against her chest, and even through her tears passengers could see the horrifying displacement of bone, could see the unnatural angle, could see that this child's arm was catastrophically broken. My arm, Gabrielle had sobbed, looking down at the damage in disbelief. My arm, oh God, my arm, please help me, somebody please help me, it hurts so bad. Her gift bag had fallen and torn open when she'd hit the floor, purple and silver and gold beads scattering across the terminal tile in every direction, the bracelet she'd spent 2 weeks making destroyed in seconds, pieces of her love for Aunt Monica rolling under seats and into corners where they'd never be recovered. Gabrielle had reached for them with her good hand, had tried to gather beads even while her broken arm screamed agony, had sobbed, I made it for her, I made it for my auntie, please someone help me pick them up. The passengers who'd been recording had finally moved, several rushing forward, a woman screaming she broke that child's arm, someone else shouting for security, for help, for anyone with authority to do something about what they'd just witnessed. Rhonda had backed away from Gabrielle's crumpled form, her face draining of color as the reality of what she'd done registered, as she'd understood that breaking a child's bone in front of witnesses with cameras meant consequences she couldn't talk her way out of. She pulled away, Rhonda had stammered, it was an accident. She jerked back and I was just trying to move her aside, I didn't mean for this to happen. But a white man in his 70s, a grandfather who'd been standing 3 feet away in the boarding line, had pushed forward with fury transforming his weathered face. You're a liar, he'd said loudly, kneeling beside Gabrielle. I watched you grab that child and yank her like a rag doll. You twisted her arm deliberately. This was no accident, this was assault, and everyone here saw it. A woman in scrubs had rushed over identifying herself as a retired emergency room nurse, had knelt on Gabrielle's other side and carefully examined the injury without touching. Compound fracture of the radius and ulna, she'd announced, her professional assessment making the damage real in medical terms. She needs emergency care immediately. This is serious. Bone might have penetrated skin. She could have nerve damage or vascular compromise. The nurse had looked up at Rhonda with disgust that needed no medical terminology. What kind of monster breaks a child's arm? She'd asked, her voice shaking. What kind of person sees a 13-year-old crying about her dying aunt and responds with violence? Gabrielle had been sobbing on the cold terminal floor, her broken arm cradled against her body, her gift for Aunt Monica destroyed and scattered, her chance to make the flight evaporating with each passing second. I just wanted to see my auntie, she'd wept, the words barely comprehensible through pain and grief. I just wanted to give her the bracelet. I made it special for her. I prayed over every bead and now it's all ruined and my arm hurts so bad and I'm never going to make it to Houston. The grandfather had taken her good hand in both of his, had held it gently while tears streamed down his own face. You'll see her, sweetheart, he'd promised, his voice thick with emotion. I promise you're going to see your aunt. Help is coming right now. You just hold on. Other passengers had finally found their voices, had started demanding to know why security wasn't there yet, why the gate agent was still standing there instead of being arrested, why it had taken a child's bone breaking for anyone to act. 3 people had been on their phones with 911, 4 more had been showing their video footage to each other confirming what they'd witnessed, The gate area had transformed from silent complicity to outraged testimony. But for Gabrielle, none of it mattered. None of the belated concern or promised help could undo the fact that her arm was broken, her bracelet was destroyed, her flight was leaving without her, and Aunt Monica was in Houston, probably checking her phone, wondering when her niece would land. The pain in her arm had been excruciating, throbbing with each heartbeat, radiating up to her shoulder and down to her fingertips. But the pain in her heart had been worse because she'd failed, had let her mother down, had let her aunt down, had let the whole church down after they'd sacrificed to send her. And if you're watching a 13-year-old girl sob on an airport floor with a broken arm and scattered bracelet beads and you haven't subscribed yet, if you're seeing this child suffer because a gate agent's racism turned violent and you're not hitting that button, then ask yourself what makes you different from those passengers who watched for 30 minutes and said nothing until bones were breaking. Subscribe right now because your engagement creates accountability, because viral stories. Force policy changes, because the next black child traveling alone needs people who'll speak up before the violence starts, not after. Hit subscribe and share this because silence enabled every second of Gabrielle's torture and your voice can protect the next child. Airport security had been called the moment Gabrielle's scream echoed through the terminal, multiple passengers dialing simultaneously to report an assault, their voices overlapping with urgency that communicated this wasn't a minor incident but a genuine emergency requiring immediate response. The grandfather still knelt beside Gabrielle, holding her uninjured hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm while he murmured reassurances that help was coming, that she was brave, that everything would be okay, even though his own eyes showed he wasn't sure that was true. The retired nurse had positioned herself to shield Gabrielle from the growing crowd of onlookers, had used her body and her authoritative presence to create a small bubble of privacy around a child whose pain had become public spectacle. "Don't try to move, sweetheart," the nurse had instructed gently. "I know you want to gather your beads, but we need to keep you still until paramedics arrive. Moving could make the fracture worse." "But my bracelet," Gabrielle had sobbed, looking at the purple and silver and gold beads scattered across dirty terminal tile, some crushed under passenger feet, some kicked aside, some disappearing into the gaps between floor panels. "It took me 2 weeks to make it. I prayed over every single bead for Aunt Monica's healing. I can't leave without it." The nurse had felt tears stinging her own eyes because this child, broken and bleeding on the floor, was more worried about a homemade gift than her own injury, was crying harder about beads than bones, was thinking about her dying aunt instead of her own pain. "We'll get every bead, honey," the nurse had promised, looking around at the passengers standing nearby. "We'll find them all and someone will restring it for you. You're still going to give that bracelet to your aunt." Several passengers had dropped to their knees then and begun carefully collecting beads, cupping them in their palms, checking under seats and in corners, treating each small piece of glass and metal like it was precious because they'd finally understood that to Gabrielle it was precious. It was 2 weeks of love compressed into purple and silver and gold. A businessman in an expensive suit had been crawling on the floor gathering beads into his handkerchief. A young mother with a toddler had been reaching into crevices her small fingers could access, strangers working together to recover pieces of a broken gift for a broken child. Rhonda had still been standing against the wall where she'd retreated after Gabrielle fell, her face cycling through expressions of shock and fear and the dawning realization that her career and possibly her freedom were ending. She'd started trying to explain to nearby passengers, had been saying it was an accident over and over, like repetition would make it true, like if she said the words enough times the video footage would somehow change. But the grandfather had stood and faced her with fury that made Rhonda take another step back. "Don't you dare call this an accident," he'd said, his voice carrying across the gate area. "I watched you grab that child with hatred in your eyes. I watched you yank her arm like you wanted to hurt her. This was deliberate assault and you know it." Other passengers had joined in then, voices rising to corroborate what the grandfather had witnessed. "She was vicious," a woman had called out. "I saw the whole thing. That gate agent was cruel to this girl for 30 minutes before she ever touched her, called her a charity case, threw her papers on the floor. This has been abuse from the beginning." Gabrielle had barely registered the confrontation, had been consumed by pain that was intensifying as shock wore off, as adrenaline faded and left nothing but raw nerve endings screaming. She tried to breathe through it the way her mother had taught her when she'd fallen off her bike at 9 and broken her wrist, but this hurt so much worse, hurt in ways that made her nauseous and dizzy, Hurt so badly she'd thought she might pass out. "I need my mama," Gabrielle had whispered to the nurse, tears streaming steadily now. "Can someone call my mama? Her number is in my phone. She needs to know what happened." The nurse had retrieved Gabrielle's phone from where it had fallen, had unlocked it at Gabrielle's whispered instruction, had found the contact labeled mama with a heart emoji and pressed call. The phone had rung 4 times before Denise had answered, her voice cheerful, expecting to hear her daughter had landed safely. "Baby girl," Denise had said, "you there already? How was the flight?" The nurse had taken a breath, steadying herself before speaking. "Ma'am, my name is Patricia Chen. I'm a retired nurse. I'm calling about your daughter Gabrielle. There's been an incident at the airport and she's been injured. She's okay, but she needs medical attention." The sound Denise had made over the phone had been somewhere between a gasp and a cry, maternal fear compressed into one sharp inhalation. "What happened?" she demanded. "What kind of injured? Where is she? Put her on the phone right now." Patricia had held the phone to Gabrielle's ear, had watched the child's face crumple as she'd heard her mother's voice. "Mama," Gabrielle had sobbed, "a gate agent broke my arm. She grabbed me and twisted it, and now it's broken really bad and I can't get on the plane, and the bracelet for Aunt Monica is all scattered, and I'm so sorry, Mama. I tried to be good, but she was so mean." Denise's voice through the phone speaker had been thick with tears and barely controlled rage. "Baby, you have nothing to be sorry for," she'd said. "Nothing, do you hear me? This is not your fault. Mama's coming right now. I'm getting in the car and I'm coming to get you." "But Houston," Gabrielle had whispered, "Aunt Monica is waiting for me. I was supposed to be there today." The despair in those words had made Patricia wipe tears from her own eyes, had made the businessman collecting beads pause and press his fist against his mouth, had reminded everyone within earshot that this wasn't just about a broken arm but about a dying woman who wouldn't see her niece, about love interrupted by violence, about cruelty that rippled outward, touching people hundreds of miles away. Security officers had arrived running, 3 of them converging on Gate 17 with radios crackling and expressions showing they'd been told this was serious, that a child was hurt, that witnesses were reporting assault by airline staff. They'd stopped short when they'd seen Gabrielle on the floor with her arm bent wrong, had seen the scattered beads and the crying passengers and Rhonda backed against the wall, had taken in a scene that told a story before anyone spoke a word. "What happened here?" the lead security officer had demanded, a woman in her 40s named Martinez whose own daughter was around Gabrielle's age, who was responsible for this child's injury. 6 passengers had started talking at once, voices overlapping in their urgency to report what they'd witnessed, to make sure Rhonda couldn't lie her way out of what she'd done. The grandfather had been loudest, had pointed at Rhonda and said that gate agent assaulted this child, grabbed her arm and yanked her so hard the bone broke. "I saw the whole thing and I've got video." Martinez had knelt beside Gabrielle first before dealing with Rhonda, had put her hand gently on the girl's shoulder. "Sweetheart, I'm Officer Martinez," she'd said softly. "Paramedics are on their way. Can you tell me what happened to your arm?" "The gate agent grabbed me," Gabrielle had whispered through tears. "I was just trying to board my flight to see my aunt who has cancer, and she said I had to wait, and then when boarding started she wouldn't let me on, and I asked her please because my aunt is dying, and she got really mad and grabbed my arm and pulled me and it broke." The simple recitation of facts delivered in a child's pain-broken voice had been more damning than any accusation, had laid out the sequence of events in a way that made Rhonda's cruelty undeniable. Martinez had stood and fixed Rhonda with a look that promised consequences. "Ma'am, I need you to stay right where you are," she'd said. "Don't move, don't leave this area, we're going to need to take your statement." But before Rhonda could respond, before Martinez could begin formal questioning, movement at the edge of the gate area had drawn everyone's attention. A woman in a tailored navy suit had been walking quickly toward the commotion, her heels clicking sharply against tile, her expression already hardening as she'd taken in the scene. Airport staff had moved aside for her automatically, their body language showing deference that communicated authority. Denise Crawford was the Airport Operations Director, 52 years old and 28 years in aviation, a black woman who'd climbed from customer service agent to executive leadership through competence that couldn't be denied and determination that wouldn't be stopped. She'd been in a budget meeting when her assistant had interrupted to say there was a situation. "What happened here?" Denise had asked, her voice calm but carrying weight that made everyone straighten. "I need someone to explain right now why there's a child on my floor." Officer Martinez had started to answer, but the grandfather had stepped forward holding his phone. "Ma'am, I have video," he'd said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I recorded what that gate agent did to this child and you need to see it. Everyone needs to see it." "Show me," Denise had commanded, and the grandfather had pulled up the footage, had handed over his phone, had watched her face as she'd seen Rhonda grab Gabrielle, had seen the vicious yank, had heard the crack even through the phone's small speaker. Denise had watched 10 seconds, maybe 15, before her expression had transformed from professional concern to cold fury that made Rhonda visibly shrink. She'd handed the phone back and walked directly to where Rhonda stood, had stopped close enough that the gate agent had to look up to meet her eyes. "Ms. Marsh," Denise had said, each word precise and final, "your badge, give it to me right now." Rhonda's face had gone pale as the implications registered, as she'd understood that whatever excuses she'd been preparing wouldn't matter, that the woman standing in front of her had authority and intention to use it. "I can explain," Rhonda had stammered. The girl was being difficult. She wouldn't listen to instructions. "I was trying to move her aside for safety reasons." "Safety reasons," Denise had repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper somehow more terrifying than shouting. "You broke a 13-year-old girl's arm for safety reasons. You assaulted a child who was trying to board a flight to see her dying aunt, and you call that safety." She was being disruptive. Rhonda had tried again, her voice desperate. She kept approaching the counter when I told her to wait. She wouldn't follow directions. Denise had held out her hand, palm up, waiting. "Your badge, Ms. Marsh," she'd said. "You're terminated effective immediately. I don't need to hear another word. I watched you assault a child on video and that's all the information I need." "You can't do this," Rhonda had protested, panic rising in her voice. "I have union representation. I have rights. You have to follow procedures." "You assaulted a minor," Denise had said, "and assault voids every protection you think you have. Your union can't save you from criminal charges. Your rights don't include breaking children's bones. Now give me your badge or I'll have security remove it from you." Rhonda's hands had trembled as she'd unclipped her badge, had held it for a moment like letting go meant accepting the end of everything. Denise had taken it, had held it up for everyone to see. "This woman is no longer employed by this airport," Denise had announced to the gathered crowd. "She's banned from these premises permanently, and she'll be facing criminal charges for what she did to this child." She turned to Martinez. "Escort her out. Call police to meet us. I want her arrested before she leaves airport property, and make sure every witness who wants to give a statement has the opportunity." As security had moved to take Rhonda's arms, as the reality of arrest had become imminent, Rhonda had started screaming. "This isn't fair," she'd shrieked. "That girl was being disruptive. These people always cause problems. I was just doing my job." "These people," Denise had said, her voice cutting through Rhonda's hysteria. "That child lying on my floor with a broken arm has more dignity than you'll ever possess. Now get her out of my sight." Rhonda had been escorted away by security officers who'd gripped her arms firmly, had walked her past the crowd of passengers who'd watched with expressions ranging from satisfaction to disgust, had marched her down the concourse while she'd continued screaming about unfair treatment and union rights and how she'd been doing her job. Her voice had faded as distance grew, but her final words had echoed back. "I'll sue for wrongful termination. You'll all regret this." And then she'd been gone, removed from the terminal she'd worked in for 16 years, banned from the airport where she'd spent nearly 2 decades. The gate area had fallen quiet except for Gabrielle's soft crying, the child still on the floor cradling her broken arm, still surrounded by strangers who'd finally found their voices too late to prevent her suffering. Denise had turned from watching Rhonda's removal and had knelt beside Gabrielle, her entire demeanor transforming from director delivering consequences to human being offering comfort. "Sweetheart," Denise had said gently, reaching out to brush tears from Gabrielle's cheek. "My name is Denise Crawford and I run operations for this airport. Can you tell me your name?" "Gabrielle," the girl had whispered, looking up at this woman whose face showed kindness that felt foreign after 30 minutes of Rhonda's cruelty. "My name is Gabrielle Thompson." "Gabrielle, that's a beautiful name," Denise had said, maintaining eye contact, showing this child she mattered. She was seen. She deserved gentleness. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you. What that woman did was wrong and evil and should never have happened on my watch." "My aunt is dying," Gabrielle had said, the words tumbling out between sobs. "She has cancer in Houston and I was supposed to fly there today to give her a bracelet I made. I spent 2 weeks making it and now it's broken and scattered everywhere and I missed my flight and she's waiting for me and I let everyone down. The despair in her voice had made Denise's eyes fill with tears she didn't bother hiding. You didn't let anyone down, baby, Denise had said firmly. You are a victim of assault, you did nothing wrong, and I promise you we're going to make this right. She'd looked around at the passengers who'd been collecting beads, had seen the businessman's handkerchief full of purple and silver and gold, had seen others still searching under seats. Bring me every bead you found, Denise had instructed, every single one. This child's gift is going to be restored. People had come forward with cupped hands and pockets and handkerchiefs, had poured beads carefully into the torn gift bag, had treated each piece like it mattered because Denise's tone had made clear it did matter. The grandfather had knelt again and placed his collection gently in the bag, had squeezed Gabrielle's uninjured hand. Your bracelet is going to be even more beautiful when it's fixed, he'd said, his voice thick with emotion, because it'll have a story of people coming together to restore what hatred tried to destroy. Paramedics had arrived then with equipment and gentle efficiency, had carefully examined Gabrielle's arm without moving it unnecessarily, had confirmed what the retired nurse had assessed. Definite compound fracture, the lead paramedic had reported. We need to immobilize and transport immediately. She needs surgery to set this properly. They'd prepared a stretcher and had lifted Gabrielle onto it with movements designed to minimize pain, had secured her arm in a temporary splint, had started in 4 for fluids and pain medication. Throughout the process, Denise had stayed close, had held Gabrielle's good hand, had kept up a steady stream of reassurance. We're taking you to County Medical, Denise had explained. It's 10 minutes away and they have the best pediatric orthopedic team in the state. Your mother is already on her way, and I'm calling the airline right now to arrange everything for when you're recovered. But Aunt Monica, Gabrielle had whispered as medication started dulling her pain, she's waiting for me in Houston. Someone needs to tell her I'm not coming. Denise had pulled out her phone. What's your aunt's number, sweetheart? She'd asked. I'll call her personally and explain what happened. I'll make sure she knows you tried everything to get to her. Gabrielle had recited the number through tears, had listened as Denise had dialed, had heard the phone ring and then her aunt's weak voice answering. Ms. Monica Thompson, Denise had said, my name is Denise Crawford. I'm the airport operations director. I'm calling about your niece Gabrielle. Is she okay? Monica's voice had come through the speaker, fear making her sound even more fragile. Did something happen to the flight? There was an incident at the airport, Denise had explained carefully. A staff member assaulted Gabrielle and broke her arm. She's being transported to the hospital now for surgery. She's going to be fine, but she won't be able to fly today. The sound Monica had made had been grief layered over illness, had been the cry of someone who'd been holding on to hope of seeing her niece and had just watched that hope shatter. My baby, Monica had sobbed. Someone hurt my baby. Is she in pain? Can I talk to her? Denise had held the phone to Gabrielle's ear, had watched tears stream down the girl's face as she'd heard her aunt crying. Auntie, I'm so sorry, Gabrielle had whispered. I tried so hard to get there. I made you a bracelet and I was going to give it to you, but the lady broke my arm and broke the bracelet too. Don't you apologize, baby girl, Monica had said through her own tears. You didn't do anything wrong. I'm just so sorry someone hurt you. I wish I could hold you right now. I'll get there, Auntie, Gabrielle had promised. As soon as my arm is fixed, I'll come see you. I promise I won't let you down. You could never let me down, Monica had said. You're my brave, beautiful niece and I love you more than all the stars. You focus on healing and I'll be right here waiting. The paramedics had needed to transport, had gently told Denise they needed to leave for the hospital. Denise had stood and addressed the crowd of passengers still gathered. I need every person who witnessed what happened to leave their contact information with airport security, she'd announced. This woman will be prosecuted and your testimony will be essential. Thank you to everyone who helped collect beads and who stayed to support this child. As the stretcher had been wheeled toward the exit, as Gabrielle had been carried away from gate 17 where she'd spent the worst hour of her life, the grandfather had called out one more time. You're the bravest girl I've ever met, Gabrielle, he'd shouted, his voice carrying across the terminal. Your Aunt Monica is going to be so proud of you. Gabrielle had managed a tiny smile through her pain and her tears, had lifted her good hand in a small wave, and then she disappeared around the corner, leaving behind scattered papers and a gate that would be closed pending investigation and a story that would spread through the airport and then the internet and then the country about what happened when racism turned violent and when one director decided that consequences would be immediate and total. The ambulance ride to County Medical had taken 12 minutes through afternoon traffic, paramedics monitoring Gabrielle's vital signs while pain medication worked through her system, making everything feel distant and foggy, making the broken arm hurt less but making her thoughts swim. She drifted in and out of awareness, had surfaced to find herself being wheeled through emergency room doors, had heard voices discussing fractures and surgery and parental consent, had tried to focus but exhaustion and medication had pulled her back under. In the emergency department, doctors had examined her arm with gentle expertise, had ordered x-rays that confirmed what everyone already knew, compound fracture of both the radius and ulna requiring surgical intervention to properly align the bones and ensure healing without complications. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Catherine Mills, had reviewed the imaging and explained to the nurses that this would require pins and possibly a plate, that the fracture was severe enough to need general anesthesia, that they needed parental consent before proceeding. Gabrielle's mother had arrived at the hospital 90 minutes after the initial call, had driven from their apartment at speeds that terrified her but felt necessary, had run through the emergency room doors demanding to know where her daughter was. A nurse had taken her directly to Gabrielle's bed where the girl lay with her arm immobilized, with 4 fluids running, with monitors beeping steady rhythms. "Baby," Denise had cried out, collapsing beside the bed, "Oh my baby girl," and Gabrielle had opened her eyes and seen her mother and started sobbing fresh tears that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with finally feeling safe. "Mama, I'm so sorry," Gabrielle had wept. "I tried to be good, I had all my papers and I was polite and I waited like she told me, but she was so mean and she wouldn't let me board and then she grabbed me and my arm broke." Denise had held her daughter's face in both hands, had looked into eyes that showed trauma no 13-year-old should carry. "You have nothing to be sorry for," she'd said fiercely. "Nothing. Do you understand me? This was not your fault. That woman assaulted you and she's going to pay for what she did." Dr. Mills had entered then, had introduced herself and explained the surgery, had shown Denise the x-rays with their clear evidence of displaced fractures. "We need to operate within the next 2 hours," the surgeon had explained. "The bones need to be realigned and stabilized with hardware. She'll have a cast for 6 to 8 weeks and will need physical therapy, but with proper treatment she should regain full function." The word should have made Denise's stomach drop because it wasn't guaranteed, was a possibility rather than a promise. "What if she doesn't regain full function?" Denise had asked. "What are we talking about in worst case scenario?" Dr. Mills had been honest because parents deserve truth. Worst case would be permanent reduced mobility in the wrist, possible chronic pain, potential for early arthritis, but I don't expect that outcome. The fracture is clean despite being displaced, she's young and will heal well, I'm very optimistic about her recovery. Denise had signed consent forms with shaking hands, had kissed Gabrielle's forehead a dozen times before the anesthesiologist had come to take her to surgery. "I'll be right here when you wake up, baby," Denise had promised. "Mama's not going anywhere, you're going to be okay." The surgery had taken 2 hours and 17 minutes. Dr. Mills emerging afterward to report that everything had gone perfectly, bones aligned properly, 2 pins inserted to stabilize the fracture, cast applied from wrist to just below elbow. "She did beautifully," the surgeon had said. "She's in recovery now and you can see her in about 20 minutes. When Gabrielle had woken groggy and disoriented, she'd looked immediately for her mother, had found Denise sitting beside her holding her good hand. "Mama," Gabrielle had whispered, "my arm feels weird." "That's the medicine, baby," Denise had soothed. "You had surgery and Dr. Mills fixed your bones. You're going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay." "But Aunt Monica," Gabrielle had said, tears forming again, "I didn't get to see her, I failed." A voice from the doorway had interrupted. "You didn't fail, sweetheart," Denise Crawford had said, walking in with the torn gift bag now carefully repaired, "and you're going to see your aunt tomorrow because the airline is flying both you and your mother to Houston first class, all expenses paid, as soon as the doctor clears you to travel." She'd approached the bed and had opened the gift bag to reveal the bracelet, completely rest-wrung with every bead recovered, the purple and silver and gold restored to their original pattern. "We had airport staff work on this for 3 hours," Denise had explained. They found every bead, matched your pattern from a photo someone took before it broke, and added this. She'd pointed to a small silver airplane charm that hadn't been there before, strung among the beads. So your aunt knows how far you traveled to see her, Denise had said, so she knows that not even violence could stop your love from reaching her. Gabrielle had started crying again, but these tears carried different weight, carried gratitude and relief and the beginning of healing. It's perfect, she'd whispered. It's so perfect, thank you. Denise Crawford had pulled papers from her briefcase. The airline is also covering all your medical expenses, she'd said, every surgery cost, every follow-up appointment, every physical therapy session, and they've opened an investigation into how our hiring and training allowed someone like Rhonda Marsh to have access to passengers. Your mother doesn't have to pay anything, Denise had continued, and when you're ready to travel we have a first-class cabin reserved for you both. Full service, anything you need, you're going to Houston in comfort and dignity. When Gabrielle had asked, when can we go? Dr. Mills had answered from where she'd been standing in the doorway listening. If you're feeling strong enough tomorrow afternoon, she'd said, I'll clear you to fly. You'll need to be careful with the arm, but there's no medical reason you can't travel. Tomorrow, Gabrielle had repeated, looking at her mother with hope that had been crushed and was now rebuilding. I can still see Aunt Monica tomorrow. Denise had nodded through tears. We're going, baby, she'd promised. We're going to Houston and you're going to give your aunt that beautiful bracelet and she's going to know how much you love her. That night in the hospital room while Gabrielle slept fitfully, while nurses checked vitals and adjusted medication, Denise had sat in the chair beside her daughter's bed and had wept quietly for everything her baby had endured, for the racism that had targeted a child trying to deliver love, for the violence that had broken bones over boarding passes, for the cruelty that still existed in a world that claimed to have moved past such things. But she'd also felt gratitude for Denise Crawford who'd fired without hesitation, for the grandfather who'd defended, for the nurse who'd helped, for the passengers who'd collected beads, for everyone who'd finally done something even if it came too late to prevent the harm. The following afternoon Gabrielle and her mother had boarded a flight to Houston, not the original economy seat Gabrielle had been prevented from taking but first-class accommodations that the airline had arranged with profuse apologies and genuine remorse. The flight crew had been briefed about what happened, had treated Gabrielle with tenderness that bordered on reverence, had made sure she was comfortable and had everything she needed, had checked on her so frequently that Denise had finally told them gently that her daughter just needed to rest. Gabrielle had sat by the window with her casted arm supported by pillows, had watched clouds drift past while her mother held her good hand, had clutched the repaired bracelet in its gift bag like a talisman. The other first-class passengers had noticed her cast decorated with stickers the nurses had applied, had seen her young face still showing traces of trauma, and several had approached quietly to say they'd heard what happened and were sorry, that they hoped she felt better soon, that they admired her bravery. At Houston's airport, Aunt Monica had been waiting at the gate in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse, her body ravaged by cancer treatment but her face alight with joy at seeing her niece. Gabrielle, Monica had cried out, her voice weak but filled with love. Oh my baby girl, come here. Gabrielle had run to her aunt despite her mother's warning to be careful, had thrown her good arm around Monica's thin shoulders and had sobbed into her neck. Auntie, I'm so sorry it took so long, she'd wept. I tried to get here yesterday but everything went wrong. Monica had held her niece as tightly as her weakened body allowed, had stroked her hair and made soothing sounds. You're here now, baby. That's all that matters. You're here and I get to hold you and that's everything. In Monica's hospital room where she was receiving her latest round of chemotherapy, Gabrielle had carefully opened the gift bag and had pulled out the bracelet with its purple and silver and gold beads, with its new airplane charm that caught the light. I made this for you, Auntie, Gabrielle had said, her voice trembling. I prayed over every bead for your healing, and even though it got broken when that lady hurt me, good people put it back together, kind of like how good people helped me when I was broken. Monica had wept as Gabrielle had clasped the bracelet around her thin wrist, had held her arm up to admire how the beads caught sunlight streaming through the window. This is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me, Monica had said, and every time I look at it I'll remember that my niece loved me enough to endure pain to bring it to me. That's a kind of love that heals better than any medicine. They'd spent 3 days together, Gabrielle sleeping in a cot beside Monica's hospital bed, her mother in a nearby hotel the airline had paid for, the three of them making memories in stolen hours between treatment sessions. Monica had been able to leave the hospital for a few hours on day 2, had insisted on taking Gabrielle for ice cream despite her nausea, had wanted normal moments with her niece while she still could. 3 months after the incident, Rhonda Marsh had stood trial in criminal court, her case assigned to Judge Patricia Williams, a black woman in her 50s whose own daughter had been racially profiled at an airport years earlier. The evidence against Rhonda had been irrefutable: security footage from multiple angles showing the assault in detail, videos from 6 passenger phones capturing different perspectives, medical records documenting the severity of Gabrielle's injuries, witness testimony from the grandfather and the nurse, and a dozen others who'd seen everything. The prosecution had presented their case methodically, had played the videos showing Rhonda's escalating cruelty over 30 minutes, had brought medical experts to testify about the force required to break both bones in a child's forearm, had called Gabrielle's mother to describe the impact on their family. Denise had testified about her daughter's nightmares, about panic attacks when seeing airport uniforms, about the medical bills that would have bankrupted them without the airline's intervention, about trauma that would take years to heal. Rhonda's defense attorney had tried to argue that she'd been attempting to maintain order, that Gabrielle had pulled away causing her own injury, that the incident was a tragic accident rather than deliberate assault. But the videos had destroyed that narrative, had shown clearly that Rhonda had grabbed and yanked with force that was excessive by any standard, that her actions were motivated by rage rather than any legitimate security concern. Gabrielle had testified via video link because the prosecution hadn't wanted her to face Rhonda in person, had sat in a victim advocate's office and had answered questions about what happened, about how it felt, about the lasting effects. "She told me I was a charity case," Gabrielle had said, her voice steady but quiet. "She threw my papers on the floor and made me pick them up. She ignored me for 30 minutes while I begged to board the flight to see my dying aunt. And then when I cried, she got angry and grabbed my arm and hurt me." "Did you do anything to provoke her?" the defense attorney had asked, trying to find some justification for his client's actions. Gabrielle had looked directly at the camera. "I was black and poor and alone," she'd said with wisdom beyond her 13 years. "That was enough to provoke her. That's all it took." The jury had deliberated for 90 minutes, returning with a verdict that surprised no one who'd seen the evidence. Guilty of assault on a minor, guilty of civil rights violations, guilty on every count the prosecution had brought. Rhonda had collapsed at the defense table, her face showing shock as though she genuinely believed her excuses would work, as though she'd thought targeting a black child would somehow be forgiven. Judge Williams had scheduled sentencing for the following week, had reviewed Rhonda's history showing a pattern of complaints about her treatment of passengers of color, had read impact statements from Gabrielle and her mother and Aunt Monica. "Ms. Marsh," the judge had said, looking at Rhonda with contempt that needed no amplification, "you broke a child's arm because she wanted to see her dying aunt. You showed no remorse during this trial. You blamed your victim repeatedly. You demonstrated that you believe your authority entitled you to violence against children you deemed unworthy of basic human dignity." The courtroom had been packed, Gabrielle watching again via video link with her mother and Aunt Monica beside her. 3 years in federal prison. Judge Williams had announced no possibility of parole, permanent ban from any position of authority over vulnerable populations, and upon release you'll be required to complete 500 hours of community service in organizations serving communities of color. Rhonda had screamed as bailiffs had approached, had shouted that this was excessive, that 3 years was too harsh, that she'd made one mistake. "One mistake," Judge Williams had repeated, her voice cutting through Rhonda's protests. "You call breaking a child's bone one mistake as though 30 minutes of racial harassment leading to physical assault can be reduced to a momentary lapse in judgment. You still don't understand what you did or why it was wrong, and that's exactly why 3 years is appropriate." Rhonda had been led away in handcuffs, her family conspicuously absent from the courtroom because her adult children had publicly distanced themselves from their mother's actions, because her husband had filed for divorce 2 months into the proceedings, because everyone who'd once stood beside her had decided that defending racism came at too high a cost. She disappeared through the courtroom doors, still shouting about injustice, still claiming victimhood, still refusing to acknowledge that she'd terrorized a child. Gabrielle had watched the sentencing from Monica's living room in Houston, where she'd been spending spring break, had felt her aunt squeeze her hand when the verdict was read. "Justice, baby," Monica had whispered. "It takes time, but it comes for people who hurt children." 1 year after the incident, Gabrielle had been invited to speak at a national passenger rights conference, had stood on a stage in front of 400 airline executives and policymakers and advocacy groups, had looked out at faces waiting to hear from the girl whose broken arm had sparked industry-wide reforms. She'd grown taller in that year, had turned 14, had regained full mobility in her arm after months of physical therapy, had learned to carry trauma without letting it define her. "A woman broke my arm because I was black and poor and traveling alone," Gabrielle had said into the microphone, her voice steady and clear. She saw a 13-year-old girl trying to visit her dying aunt, and she decided I didn't deserve kindness or dignity or even basic humanity. She harassed me for 30 minutes, and then she hurt me in a way that could have caused permanent damage. The room had been silent, every person present understanding they were witnessing testimony that indicted not just one gate agent but systems that had allowed Rhonda Marsh to abuse passengers for 16 years without consequence. "But I learned something that day," Gabrielle had continued. "I learned that broken arms heal, that bones knit back together stronger than before. I learned that broken spirits don't have to stay broken if you have people who love you and systems that finally decide to protect you." She'd paused, had looked directly at the airline executives in the front rows. "I also learned that broken people who hurt children eventually face justice," she'd said, "maybe not immediately, maybe not without having to suffer first, but justice comes, and the woman who broke my arm is in prison now serving 3 years because what she did to me mattered enough for prosecutors to charge her and judges to sentence her." The audience had risen in standing ovation, 400 people on their feet applauding a 14-year-old who'd turned her trauma into testimony, who'd refused to let violence silence her voice. In the front row, Denise had been weeping with pride. Beside her, Monica had clutched her beaded bracelet that she'd worn every single day for a year, the purple and silver and gold beads that represented love strong enough to survive assault. And if you've watched Gabrielle's entire journey from broken arm on an airport floor to standing ovation at a conference and you haven't subscribed yet, if you've seen this child's courage and resilience and you're not hitting that button, ask yourself what makes you different from those passengers who watched her suffer for 30 minutes before acting. Subscribe right now, because engagement forces accountability, because viral stories create policy changes that protect the next Black child. Traveling alone. Hit subscribe and share this because your voice amplifies Gabrielle's message that children deserve protection and racists deserve consequences. Aunt Monica's cancer had gone into remission 6 months after Gabrielle's visit. The doctors calling it remarkable, though Monica had credited the bracelet, had said her niece's prayers woven into purple and silver and gold had carried healing that medicine alone couldn't provide. She'd gained back 15 pounds, her hair had grown in after chemotherapy, she'd returned to work part-time, and every morning she'd clasped that bracelet around her wrist before facing the day. Gabrielle had visited Houston 4 more times that year, had flown with her mother in economy because first class didn't matter anymore. What mattered was getting to Monica, spending time together, making memories while they could, because remission wasn't cure and both of them understood that borrowed time was still precious. They'd baked together and watched movies and talked about everything and nothing, building relationship that distance and illness had tried to steal. In a federal prison 3 states away, Rhonda Marsh served her sentence in isolation, both physical and social, other inmates having learned what she'd done, guards treating her with professional coldness that communicated their contempt. She'd been denied parole at her first hearing, the board citing lack of genuine remorse and continued insistence that her actions had been justified. She'd served the full 3 years with no early release for good behavior because her behavior showed she still believed breaking a Black child's arm was acceptable response to perceived disrespect. Every night in her cell, Rhonda heard that crack, the sound of Gabrielle's bones breaking, the echo that haunted dreams and waking hours, the auditory reminder that some choices created consequences that lasted far longer than the moment it took to make them. She'd lost her career, her marriage, her children's respect, her freedom, all of it gone because she decided that a 13-year-old Black girl didn't deserve to board a plane. 2 years after the incident, Gabrielle had participated in the ribbon cutting for the Gabrielle Thompson Passenger Protection Initiative, an airline industry program named in her honor that mandated bias training for all customer-facing staff, created immediate reporting systems for discrimination complaints, and established zero-tolerance policies for employee harassment of minors. The program had been adopted by 17 major airlines, had already prevented documented incidents of racial profiling, had created accountability where silence had previously protected abusers. Standing at that ribbon cutting with scissors in her hand, with her mother beside her and Aunt Monica watching via video link because travel had become difficult again as cancer returned, Gabrielle had understood that her broken arm had become a bridge, connecting her personal trauma to systemic change, proving that sometimes the worst moments of our lives become catalysts for protecting others from experiencing the same pain. She'd cut the ribbon and cameras had flashed and people had applauded, and somewhere in Texas Monica had watched the live stream clutching her beaded bracelet, purple and silver and gold catching afternoon light, a tangible reminder that love sent across distance, even when interrupted by violence, even when delivered late and through pain, still arrived exactly when it needed to, still healed exactly what it was meant to heal, still proved that some gifts are worth every obstacle placed in the path. A year after the incident, Jasmine and Jordan had boarded a commercial flight to visit their grandmother, had walked onto an aircraft and found their first-class seats without incident, had been greeted by a flight attendant who'd recognized them from the viral story and had thanked them for the policy changes their courage had created. The captain had emerged from the cockpit before takeoff, a black woman in her 40s, who'd knelt beside their seats and told them she'd been inspired by their story, that she flew because girls like them refused to be moved. And as the plane had taken off climbing toward cruising altitude, Jasmine had looked at Jordan and smiled, had reached for her sister's hand, and had whispered, "We really do belong here," and her twin had squeezed back and replied, "We belong everywhere." And both girls had known with certainty that their father's lesson had taken root, that Eleanor Whitmore and Captain Fisher had tried to teach them they were less than but had accidentally taught them they were more than anyone could diminish, that racism could wound but couldn't define, that first class wasn't just about seats but about knowing your worth and refusing to surrender it no matter who demanded you move.